All right, so let's get started. Okay, so today we're gonna, cover with a couple of things. Basically, this is a continuation of our UiPath Studio session. So basically, the goal here is not to help you understand variables, argument, for loop, if, and all those things. Those you understand, right? Those you understand from your previous programming construct. The basic idea here is to how to use them inside the UiPath Studio. So our goal is to help you get comfortable with UiPath Studio to do the stuff, right? So I'll be repeating some stuff like what is variable, what is if loop, what is while loop, what is for loop, what is continue, break. Those all things you know, but we need to make sure how we can apply that into UiPath Studio. That's the goal is. Okay, so let me get quickly started. So first thing that we're going to talk today is uh, variable and arguments. Okay, so what is a variable, what is argument, that we're going to discuss. So in UiPath Studio, right, variables are used to store multiple data types, very similar to other programming language where you store value temporarily. The one of the best part of UiPath Studio is supports, not only primitive and non-primitive data type, but it also support the data types which are available from a .NET family. That means you should be able to create a data type of all the types which is available in a .NET framework. So that's a really good. So you should be able to utilize full-fledged functioning of complex to complex data types like quick, list of list, and all those kind of things, right? Before that, I'll showcase you how you should be able to create a complex variable like list, array, data table, and other, .NET language supported type. But before that, let's understand what are the basic construct and how you should be able to create a variable in a UiPath Studio, right? So there are three ways of creating a UiPath variable, right? One is obviously from the variable pane, which is at the bottom of your UiPath Studio. Another one is from the designer panel. So what you can do is you can drag a assign variable, and there you can press Ctrl plus K, name it, and by changing the some values into property, you should be able to create it. And third is obviously in the properties panel. So these are the three different ways of creating a variable, and people usually ask this question to junior developer, how you should be able to create a variable in UiPath. So answer should be there are three ways of creating a variable. One thing that is you need to note here is variables in a UiPath are defined in a scope, right? So every variable that you define that has certain scope, and it will work inside that scope only. It cannot be used globally, right? So say for example, there is a big workflow, and in that workflow there is a one sequence and there is another sequence, and you defined a variable in a sequence number 2. So you can't use that variable from sequence number 2 to sequence number 1, because the scope of that variable which is defined in a sequence 2 is a sequence 2 only. But if you want to use that variable uh, you know in sequence 1 and sequence 2, then that means you need to define that variable on the parent, right? So that's how it works. And one more thing I would like to say, when you start developing a workflow, if you start giving it a meaningful name from the start, it will be very helpful, because the more you practice, and if you got a habit of creating a variable like x, y, z or a, b, c, then it will be a problem. So that's the reason I usually say all of my trainees to start giving a proper naming convention using camel case, or if not camel case, Pascal case, right? And they should follow a standard naming practices. So say for example, if you need to define a variable called employee name, give the full name employee, yeah, starting with E as a capital and N as a capital, so that the other people, not only you, because your code may be reviewed by other people, right? Or you may leave this organization and you go into another organization, and somebody will come after you and he'll have a hard time to understand why you have created those many variables and where those variables are used, right? So it's always good to create a variable with good naming in uh, conventions. So that's the one thing that you need to remember. And other thing, let's quickly move to the next slide, and there I'll discuss about what is argument and what is the purpose and uses of the argument, and then I'll go to UiPath Studio and I'll help you explain how you should be able to create variable, argument, and how you can work with this. So playing with variables and argument is really necessary in a UiPath Studio, and once you become a master of it, for loop, if, and all those things will be pretty easy, right? So let's talk about the arguments. What is an argument, right? So argument is nothing but a variable. Similar to variable, it can store a value, right? The only difference between the argument and variable is argument has a larger scope than variable. It is used to pass a value between different workflow, right? Variables are used inside a limited scope. They are limited to the workflow where it has defined, right? They are limited to the workflow in the block they have defined. But argument will work between the two different workflow. So say for example, you are creating a workflow, right? So the best practice or design practices say when you're designing a problem, you should break your problem into different parts and try to achieve the problem into by solving the smaller part, right? So when you solve the business problem in a smaller part, that means they require a data passing between one workflow to another workflow, right? So let's take example of database connectivity and putting some data over the email, right? So to solve this problem, you will break this problem into certain part. One workflow would be database connectivity, another workflow would be putting the data into Excel file, third workflow would be sending that Excel file to the Outlook, right? But all of these are connected, so you need to pass the database connection coming out from the first workflow to the second workflow so that it can fetch the data, right? And similarly, the data which is coming in a second workflow has to be passed to the third workflow so that Outlook can set that as an Excel file, right? So that means there is a passing of data between these workflow, right? And also let's take example of all these workflows are inside a main workflow, right? So there should be a scenario that you need to know that what has happened with that workflow, right? So it could be a success, it could be a failure. That means based on the execution of that workflow, you need to return the status to the parent, right? So in that case, we have three directions in which argument can be used. So one is a in, when we want to receive the value from another workflow, out if we want to send the current value to another workflow, right? Or in out if we want to get the data inside that workflow but update that data inside the workflow and send that data to out, then we'll use in out, right? So that's a difference between three. Similar to variable, UiPath supports large number of types of argument, which is basically when you say it will support all the .NET types of the variable just like you do for a variable. So there is no difference between working of argument and variable. The only difference is the scope, right? So argument can be used to flow the data between different workflow. Variable will be used inside a workflow to save data or to perform certain calculation, right? So that's the thing. So let's go to UiPath Studio, and what we can do is we can create two separate sequence, a very simple one, right? And we will we'll be performing we'll be assigning a value to argument, and in the second workflow we'll be receiving that and we'll be displaying that into a message box. So that way you'll be able to understand the working of arguments and variable. So let me stop the presentation and then I'll go to the UI. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's no sequence is not a good way to say it. Workflow, yeah. So workflow, yeah. So here whatever we decide is in a workflow. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yes, we can have n number of sequence, we can have n number of flow chart, we can have n number of state machine inside a workflow, and the communication between workflow happens on the basis of arguments, right? So argument is responsible for sending a data from out workflow or receiving a data inside a workflow. So that's the beauty of this, right. All right, so let's quickly look at how we should be able to perform this task, right? And here I'll not be only explaining you the argument and variable, but I'll be also helping you to explain how you should be able to control the different part of UiPath Studio. So goal is not only variables and argument, but goal is also to help you understand how you should be able to use UiPath Studio effectively, right? So first thing that we need to do is we need to create a workflow, as I told you. So we'll create a workflow. Let's give a workflow name as work flow, A. Okay, so we have created a workflow A, and in the workflow A, we are first going to deal with argument, and we'll be passing the data from workflow A to B, right? So let's create a workflow B as well before that, and then we'll come here. Okay, so we have a workflow B. So we have two workflows, right? Now in the workflow B, what I'll do, I have to create some variable. So I need to help you to explain how you should be able to create a variable. So I told you three ways of creating a variable, right? So the first way is you can use assign from here, or you can use assign from here. So you need to drop the assign here. Okay, and look at carefully. What you need to do is you need to go and click on assign tab. Okay, the left, and press Ctrl K. So the moment you press Ctrl K, a prompt will come and the cursor will be blinking, right? And there you can type the variable name, right? And as I told you, you should give a full name to help other to understand what this variable is all about. So I have created a variable. So we have created a variable, and by default it will turn red because there is a value that is required to assign to it. So either you can assign it to none or blank, or you can give some value. So for example, I am giving a value as Satish. Okay, so this is a string, and that's the reason I have put them into code. So by default, when you create a variable, it will be a string. By default it will be string. Sometime you because I put them into code, but sometime you will see that this will be coming as a generic variable as well, right? So I'll help you explain what is the difference between string and generic variable for now, but for sake of simplicity, let's consider with the string. Okay, so this is the first way of creating a variable. Other way of creating a variable is putting the variable into variable pane directly. So okay, so I am saying employee age. Okay, now employee age cannot be a string, right? So I can change that to integer 32. Okay, so this one, and now here I can print log message, and by saying info, and I need to print employee age. Okay, but as employee age is integer, what I can do is I need to convert that into toString for for better handling. Okay, so we can say this one. Sometime what will happen is you don't need to only print the employee age, but you need to concatenate with certain values, right? So say for example, you want to say the age is this one, so you need to put that quote, and the variable has to be concatenated with the plus. So like this. Okay, so you can, the age is employees. So this how you should be able to concatenate two string, right? So the age is a one string, and employee age dot two string is another string. So how you can concatenate the string? Using the plus symbol. So this is another way of defining a variable. Okay, so we have now two variables. All right, now what we'll do is we will use another assign method here, but this time we'll create a variable from properties panel, right? We'll not create a variable from here, we'll create a variable from properties panel. So similar to that, what we can do is we can create click here and press Ctrl K, and we will print employee salary. Okay, and here we can also put the value, say for example 10,000. So by default it's a 10,000, right? And if we wish to change this to, say for example, I am not want to store that into integer 2, but I want to store into integer 64. So the moment you click here, browse for types, it will open up this window, and this is where the magic lies. So you can see, you can create at least 10,000 types of variable, right? So that's a really wonderful feature. Yeah, so what I'll do, I'll use int 64 here. So now this one is of integer 64 type, right? So these are the three ways of creating a variable. Now let's talk about the scope. scope of a variable. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'll create another sequence inside a sequence, right? We can create as many as sequence we wish, right? And now inside a sequence, I'll create another variable with the assign method, and I'll create a variable called emp department. Okay, and I'll say department as HR. Okay, any problem here? Oh, sorry, it didn't. No, it didn't. Control K didn't work. So now it will work. Okay, so now you have. Now, what I wanted to showcase you here is this is the sequence, right? So see the scope. Employee department is defined inside the scope of sequence, but employee name, employee age, employee salary is defined into the workflow B. That means employee department cannot be accessed inside the workflow here. So if we try to print this outside, say example outside this sequence, and if we print it, right, let's say employee department, so employee department is not coming here. See, it's not coming, it's not come, right? But if we change the scope of this variable from sequence to workflow, right, and now it will, if you go here, employee department will come, right? So you understand the, yeah, because now it's a part of this parent workflow. So now the scope of all the variable are workflow, so it could be used. So this is a really good feature, because sometimes you need to override some variable, or you can define same variable with a temporary scope, right? But best practices says do not duplicate a variable with the same name, because it can create a confusion, right? And it can result into some bugs. So that's the reason, avoid doing that. But I just wanted to showcase you that it is possible to create a variable with the same name, right? All right, so this is all about the variables and how you should be able to do a basic variables, right? String, integer, and other type. For the complex variable, we will discuss that into when we start learning how to automate Excel, right? There will have a, okay, so there will have a list, there will have a data table, there will have all list of list and all those kind of things. So let's quickly move to another workflow. And here what we wanted to do is we wanted to create certain arguments. Okay, argument into is, okay. So what we'll do here is we will create arguments into this. Okay, so as I told you, argument having three directions: in out, and properties. Properties we rare, yeah. So focus only on these things. Property we'll discuss later. Okay, so in, out, and in out. Okay, so in, for in what we'll do, we usually start a naming convention with in, so that we know what is the, yeah. So we created a variable called employee name as the input. Okay, and we created another variable called employee age, right? So we created two variable, and this is of integer type. Okay, so these are the two variables we have created. We have created a two. This is, arguments are nothing but a variable. That's the reason sometimes I call it yeah, right? So now come here. So in the sign, what I'll do is I can create a variable with the same name here. Okay, and what I can do inside this workflow, I can assign this value to employee name. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm assigning a value of a variable from another variable, right? So this way you should be able to put the data which is coming as an argument to a temporary variable for a calculation, right? And similarly what we can do is, if you do not want to do it, what you can do it, you can use that directly. So let's take example. What I'm doing here is I'm checking in employee age is less than 35. Okay, then what I'll do is in the log message, okay, I'll say young. Okay, and I'll copy this from here and I'll paste it here. So notice also these things, right? How I am pasting and all those things, because that's also a way how I'm able helping you to explain how Studio works. Okay, old, right? So now I having two sequence. This is right. So I have one variable assigned here, and argument is getting stored to it, right? And I should be able to print the value of either this or either this, because they are same, right? Actually they are same. So whatever the value will come here, that will go here also, right? So now we have two workflow, right? So now the workflow A is dependent on workflow B, right? Because it requires certain data to come from certain workflow, right? So we have two ways of calling this. What we can do is we can call a workflow here. So you can use this invoke workflow file, okay? And you need to select the workflow which you want to call here. So from B, I am calling a workflow A. From B, I am calling workflow A. And the moment you select this, it will say that you need to give the arguments, right? So what argument I need to send? So for employee name, I have a variable here which is called employee name that I can send, right? So employee name will go as a employee name, and employee age will go as a employee age, right? Okay, and I'll save this. And now what I'll do, I'll help you to understand how you should be able to run this. So let's run this file. Okay, so I'll debug this file, but for debugging I'll put a bookmark here, so breakpoint, so that I'll help you explain how the control will go from this file to another file. Okay, so let's start it. Okay, so now you can see the age is 0, obviously, because we didn't assign any value, right? I wanted to help you explain what is the concept of default. That's the reason I put it blank. Okay, so now it is here, and now when I do a step into, so it will come here, and now when I do a step into, the control will go to the next file. Now it is in a file number A automatically, right? And here what will happen, if you look at the local variables, so employee name, inside the employee name, now it is variable coming as Satish, and employee age, and it's coming as 0, right? So now I move to this, now I come here, and now in employee age we have 0, and it has to be compared with 35. So it will go into the if part, I mean success, right? And it will print young, and it will complete. That means it will go to top, see, and then it will give the control back to the caller, right? So basically it uses the concept of stack, right? A process stack. You must have uh, read that concept into operating system, where every workflow is kept on a stack, and then from a stack it usually tracks. So that's basically a basic theory, right? And then it will control will come here, and then control will go to the top here, and then it will stop after this. So this is how you should be able to debug a file inside a studio. So my goal is not to only teach you how you should be able to create a variable and argument, but also you should be able to debug step by step, right? Now, so we have discussed variable, we have discussed argument, we have discussed about the type in, we have not discussed about the type out, right? And we have not discussed about the default value. So employee is by default, if I have not given any value, it is 0. So what I'll give, I'll do default is 30. So now this time the default value will automatically come here, right? And what we can do, we can use that default value, or we can create a assign variable here, and we should be able to overwrite that, right? So if I do employee age here, and if I say 45, then what value will be passed? 45, not 30, because it is getting overwritten. Yeah, you got this concept? Now come here. So now we have this. Okay, so now I'll create a variable called out. Okay, I'll say emp type. Okay, and this is, I am sending it back to the workflow which is calling it, right? So this will be out employee type, and what I'll do here is I use a sign variable, and in out employee type I'll say young. Okay, I'll copy this, I'll paste it here, I'll say old, right? And now I'll come back to my original first workflow. So when when workflow, now you can see that it is pointing that there are two arguments that you defined, but there is something which is missing. So I have a variable which is value. So out employee type is coming as a out, but we are not using it. So what we can do, we can create a variable from here as well by pressing Ctrl K and say emp type. Okay, and now as this is the out variable, so the value will be stored in a emp type here. Sorry, I don't need to overwrite it, I need to print it simply. So I'll say employee type is emp type plus emp type, right? Perfect. So now this time I don't need to use a break statement because you understand how it works. So I should be able to remove the breakpoint from here, or you should be able to remove the breakpoint from here as well. Okay, so now I'll run this. All right, so this got completed pretty fast. So see, the age is 45, right? And employee type is old, and it got completed. Now what I'll do, so now the next concept here is, if you do not want to use or temporarily disable this, you should be able to do it. So what you need to do is, you can go here and press Ctrl plus D. So it will be commented, right? So now it is got commented, and now if I run, it will take a default value as 30, and employee will become young, right? And how you should be able to enable this again? So you need to click here and press Ctrl plus E. So it will become enable, or you should be able to do it from here, right? Enable. So this is a comment, right? Next thing that we need to understand here is how you should be able to put a comment, right? So you can put a comment like that, or you can search it from here as well. So if you want to type certain text, like how it is working, you should be able to do it from here. You won't be able to change it from here, you need to change it from properties. Okay, so example of arguments, right? So this is how you should be able to put a comment. One more thing, sometime your organization will say for every workflow you should write some description what that workflow is doing. So what you can do for that case, you can create a annotations. So you can press Ctrl Shift plus F2, and you can say example of arguments. Okay, and this will create a annotations. So you should be able to, so this is basically just a best practices. You should tell about, just to other people know what to, yes, this will, no, this will go into production as well. So this is basically help you to understand, so yeah. So see, comment is used inside a workflow, right? So if you are writing some complex logic here, so what you can do, you can put a comment in the middle, right? But this annotation is basically used when you want to help other to understand what this workflow is all about on a high level. What kind of, yeah, what kind of input would be required. I usually do like this. So I say what will be the input, what will be the output of this workflow. The people will understand that I am getting this and I'll this will be coming out from this workflow. Okay. So this is the